of the West Side Legacy Stories, and I'm your host, Gabrielle Daly, and here with me is Marianne Pappas.
Hello.
When were you born?
I was born on August 29th, 1923.
How long have you lived in West Side?
Well, just about all of my life, except for a couple of years.
What changes in the town have you noticed over the years?
Well, it was a much more relaxed town when I was young. We could play anywhere, and we didn't have to be aware of a lot of things that children are up against now.
Like what?
Well, strangers. Well, you see the news that is happening during this time. Well, it was much quieter. We had little farms, and we mostly did that.
In West Side, there were little farms?
Yeah, where I live now and lived then when I was very young, all the families had a plot of land or more, and they had animals, and they had gardens and fruit trees. You could be self-sufficient and not have to go to the store for a month if,
Did your
The farm down the street had chickens and vegetables if you didn't have enough land to put it on. But that's how it went. It was a more relaxed time.
Did your family have a farm?
We had an extra plot of land. My father bought 2 building lots, what they called building lots, big enough to build a house on. So if you had 2 of them, you built a house on one, and you would use the other one for your garden.
What brought your family to West Side? Were they born here?
No, my grandfather originally came here from Italy, and like most people that come today, they usually come where other relatives are already living or friends from where they came from, and they just set up shop and buy a piece of land or not, or rent something and whatever.
Where in Italy did he come from? Or do you know?
Where to what?
Where was he from Italy?
He was from, they were from southern Italy, which was a pretty poor section of Italy. But they all grew up on farms because the weather was perfect.
Did you eat a lot of nice food growing up? A lot of spaghetti?
Well, my grandmother used to make her own spaghetti because we were self-sufficient. We made our own bread. We canned all the vegetables. There was no freezing then. We canned all the vegetables, and all we had to do was go down the cellar. If we needed a chicken and we didn't raise them, we went down the street.
So are you fully Italian, or do you have any other ethnicity?
No, I'm fully Italian. I'm a first-generation Italian. My grandmothers and grandfathers were from Italy, and
what was it like when you first moved here? Well, you kind of went over that.
yeah.
Who are some of the great characters from here?
Characters?
Yeah. Do you remember any people from here that were, great?
Well, tell you, people worked hard because, as you can imagine, if you had animals, that's no easy job. Some of them had cows and goats and pigs. They'd slaughter pigs in the springtime or whenever the time to do that was. And they processed the meat themselves. So you didn't have to depend on a store because nobody had cars in those days.
Do you remember any great stories or legends about the town?
No, not really. Not really.
What do you remember most about your parents?
Well, my father was in the First World War and got wounded. But I guess it wasn't that serious, so he went right back in once he was taken care of and stayed to the end. I think he went in 1917 and he came out in 1919 when the armistice was declared. And came home and got a job at the Westinghouse and got married and had children, and they built a house not far, a little bit distance, maybe about a street's distance from where his father and mother lived on their little mini farm.
What is the Westinghouse and where is it?
It was on Page Boulevard in Springfield. It was a big factory, a very big factory. In those years, there was a lot of manufacturing in this area, which is all gone now.
What did they make there?
They made motors, small motors, and eventually they made refrigerators and some kitchen, like roasters you could plug in if you didn't have a big stove with an oven. Some people had just burners. They didn't have an oven that came with the stove, so they would buy a roaster. And they made coolers, like Coca-Cola coolers, to keep the soda in stores. And little by little, they branched into one thing or another. And then they moved. They moved to Ohio. So a lot of jobs were lost here after the war. But it still went on for a while.
Where were your parents living when you were born?
Down the street from where I live now. They built a house.
Isn't that on Page Boulevard?
No, we lived in West Springfield.
Oh, okay, that was the Westinghouse.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we lived in West Springfield. My father had a car.
Where in West Side?
Where in West Side?
Yeah.
In the Tatum section. I went to Tatum School. In fact, Tatum School was the new school when I was old enough to go to school. There was a little one-room schoolhouse at the foot of the hill where I live. That was the original school. For many years now, it's been a house. Some people bought it and fixed it up.
What were your earliest memories growing up?
Oh, I had a lot of carefree memories. We picked berries in the fields. The summer we spent picking berries and swimming in the river, the Westfield River. We didn't have pools then. And in the winter we slid and ice skated and built snowmen. And if we got snowed out of school, in those days you didn't get snowed out of school for one day. You got snowed out of school for a week.
Man, why doesn't that happen now?
So we we would build igloos, actually, and, big enough to get in. We'd have snowball fights. We had a lot of fun.
Where did you sled and ice skate?
Right in front of my house was a hill, and because we lived off of Hillcrest Avenue, and that's almost at the top of that hill. So we could go from one hill down the road and down the next hill. So by the time we got through, we were down by the river. But we had to walk back to do it again.
And what street were you living on, or where that was?
We lived originally on Bon Air Avenue, which is off of Hillcrest. And now I live on Almond Avenue, which is the next street up. There's a little series of streets that interconnect, but don't come out to the highway. So you have to find your way out.
Do you have any siblings?
I had a brother. He was 7 years younger than I.
What were they like growing up?
Brothers, my brother. Well, he was just young enough so that I ruled the roost. In fact, I used to have to take care of him a lot. My father died when he was 35. I was 9 and my brother was 2. So my mother had to go to work. And my grandparents who lived in Boston on my mother's side came to live with us so that they could take care of us while she went to work. And she worked at the Westinghouse too, because she had worked there before her marriage, and so it was not hard for her to get a job there.
What was Boston like at that time?
Boston, we lived in what they call the Freedom Trail in Boston. You probably know about it. Quincy Market. And the building we lived in was next door to the Old North Church. So we would see all the tourists come in on the weekends because it was only open on the weekends for tourism. And it was busy, it was crowded. Anything you wanted you could have by just walking around the block or something. That's it, we walked everywhere.
What was school like for you?
I didn't hear all of that.
What was school like for you?
I liked school. School was good. In fact, I wanted to be a teacher. That was my ambition, to be a teacher. And I loved staying after school and helping the teachers. We had what we called a mimeograph machine, and it was a gel drum, and you cranked it to put the papers through. First you had to type something with purple ink and transfer it to the gel, and then you printed your papers. I loved staying after school and helping the teachers. So when I was about in the 3rd grade, I started doing that. That was my first volunteer job.
That's very nice. Okay, we're gonna backtrack to when you were living in Boston.
Okay.
Did you live near any historical areas?
Yeah, as I say, I lived right next door to the owner of the church. About 2 blocks away was Paul Revere's house. And Bunker Hill was not far away. It was right in the middle of the historic district.
What was the Oroner's Church?
The what?
The church?
The church.
Okay.
It was a Protestant church. but it was known as the Old North Church. That was the one, if you remember your history, one if by land and two if by sea.
Yeah, I've never learned that. I just
Yeah.
know, like the British are coming.
Yeah, right. Well, I lived there. It was fun. Christmas, they put a big tree, a huge tree, on the roof of where the back end of the church was, and they'd ring the bells on Sunday. That's one thing I remember about Boston that I loved. On Sundays, there was a church on every block, and the bells would ring. They'd play music, some religious music, and some music by famous authors, although I didn't know who they were then, but I did learn eventually in school. And that was pretty music, yeah. I always remember that.
Also, like, when did you move to Boston and back to West Side?
We moved to Boston because after 5 years after my father died, my grandparents wanted, we were old enough. I was, I think I was 13 or 14, but we were old enough to take care of ourselves, more or less. And my grandparents wanted to go back because they missed their friends. And so my mother decided to sell the house and go with them because when she worked, before she got married, she worked for a place that manufactured men's suits and tuxedos. And so she got to be quite a tailor, and she could get a good job there instead of working in a factory. So that's what we did. We picked up and moved. And we moved into the same apartment building that my grandmother went back to. And I stayed there. I was in the 9th grade. We stayed there. Went 1 year to school there, and we were there only for a year because we were homesick for West Springfield.
So you were in Boston during high school?
I was in Boston from the 9th grade, which at that time was junior high, and to the end of that year, then my mother decided to come back here.
So you were only there for like a year then?
That's all.
Okay.
But I spent a lot of time there because I always visited my grandmother, and I spent my summers with my grandmother.
And then you moved back with your grandparents? Or they stayed
We
there?
moved back, almost within a few months of her moving back.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did you do for fun?
Fun. We had a lot of fun. We played hide and seek. We had a light pole on the corner of our property, and that was the goal. We played giant steps. We rolled hoops up and down the street. We had picnics. We had a pine grove that belonged to, we had some rich families that lived around us. And this man had built pine trees, or planted pine trees on the edge of his property. He had quite a bit of property. So he had a grove there, and we used to have picnics in there. And if he caught us, he would yell at us to get out.
Did you do that in high school, or
No,
was that
we
throughout
were
your
younger then. We were younger there.
So what did you do for fun in high school?
High school? Well, high school, most of us got little jobs. You know, the restrictions were you had to be 16 to get a job. But we managed to find little jobs that were under the radar, so to speak.
Like what?
because we wanted money. Well, we would be errand people. I worked for a photographer that I used to go pick up the film. I used to walk Boston to pick up the film at different drugstores and bring it back to the shop and then develop it and print it. This was all done by hand, not like they do now.
Did you do any little jobs in West Side too?
Yeah, I did, but I was older then. I worked for Friendlies. I was in high school.
My grandma did that too.
Yeah, you did. My brother did work for Friendlies too. The first Friendlies was the one up on Route 20 near Toomey O'Brien's. It's gone now, of course. But that's where I worked. And after I got married, I still worked there on and off during lunchtime because my kids were in school by then. And so I had a history. And I had worked for a couple of ice cream shops that weren't Friendlies, but they were local shops. So I had a lot of experience with scooping ice cream. Yeah.
How would your friends remember you in high school?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know. I had a lot of fun. I got along with people. We never had arguments. We all did the same thing from when we were really young in grammar school until most of us split up. Some people moved and, stuff like that happens and you lose track of people.
Also, what high school did you go to in Boston? Or junior high? What was the name of it?
Junior high. Michelangelo Intermediate School. That's what it was.
And then you went to West Springfield High School?
Well, I started in West Springfield High School,
And then you went...
and then I went to Boston.
Okay.
We moved to Boston when I was in the 9th grade,
All right.
okay? And here in West Springfield, I went up to the beginning of 9th grade. Went to what is now the Coburn School. Are you from West Side?
No, but I'm here
know?
most of the time.
Yeah. Okay, Coburn School, that's the name of it now. That was the junior high school. And the high school was Cowing, which is on the park.
So those were high schools too?
That was, Cowing was a high school.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And Coburn School was the high school. It was not called Coburn School when I went to school there. It was simply called the junior high. And the high school was known as Cowing because they named it after a person, probably, I don't remember now, maybe someone that worked, a superintendent of schools or someone in town government. But those names changed.
And then you went to Tatum for elementary school?
Tatum?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tatum. I don't know how Tatum got named, but that section of town was called Tatum, and the lower section was called Mittenegg. And there was the Mittenegg School there, but that was a district. Tatum and Mittenegg, and there was another school off Riverdale Road. They were district schools. They were the grammar schools. And then everybody from those schools went to either junior high, and then from junior high they went to high school.
What are your best memories from grade school and high school?
Well, recess. Recess, we had a big yard behind the school. And we had two brooks. We had a little brook and a bigger brook. We were forbidden to go to the bigger brook because it was deeper. But if we went to the big brook, we could scrape clay because the water was only about, probably up to our ankles. And we could dig the clay up, and we used to fashion bowls and different things and then bring them in school, and the teacher would put them on the window sill, and they would dry, and then we'd take them home.
That's very cool. I feel like now if we try to go to a brook, the teachers would just yell at us and be like, get out.
If we got caught, we got yelled at, believe me. But the teachers used to yell at us, but you'd see them turn around and kind of grin to themselves. It was fun, you know.
And how about in high school? What were your best memories, like prom, dating, graduation?
Prom, yeah, I went to the prom, and but not in West Springfield, because by high school, when we moved back here, we didn't move back to the same streets we lived before. We didn't move back to our old house because it was sold, and there was nothing available, so my mother had to rent an apartment, and we had to live in Springfield off Liberty Street. But the fun of Liberty Street was Liberty Street had the Liberty Theater, and we saw every movie that ever came to the Liberty Theater because they changed the movie every week. So every week we went to the movies and maybe got a dish or a set of glasses or something. They always gave you something for going to the movies. That was the pull. Okay. They got not only your movie ticket, but money for the dishes, which were cheap, you know. But we ate on movie dishes for quite a few years.
So we're going to take a break right now. We'll be back in a few with
Okay.
our career.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Westside Legacy Stories. I'm Gabrielle Daly, and here with me is Marianne Pappas. So, what types of jobs did you have?
What you mean when I really started
Yeah,
working?
when you really started working, because we already went over it, like
Yeah.
high school.
I went to work for the Westinghouse because my parents had worked there. But it was a long time after they worked there. And I actually had to fight for a job. If you went into the office or any part of the office, you had to start as a mail girl, I suppose, to make yourself acquainted with the company, because there were several buildings there. So that's where we started, right out of high school. But the woman that hired for that she was stubborn. She wouldn't hire me because she said I lived too far away and that I would be late for work. And she couldn't take that chance. So I promised her I wouldn't. I practically stood on my head to get her to hire me. And she finally did. She said, but the first day you're late, you're out. Right?
Yikes.
Yeah. And we had a union then. We had a union that was a union shop. So I said, okay, I won't be late. And I never was late. And it gave me great pleasure to walk by her desk, which I had to do because I delivered mail in her building. That was one of the buildings. To go by her desk in the morning so that she had to say, I would say good morning to her. so she would have to answer me. And she knew I was not late for work. So and that was a stepping stone. When a job in any of the offices came up, if you were next in line, it went by when you were hired. So you followed a line. And you were offered the job. And if you wanted it, you take it. But the thing was, you better not refuse it because you may not have a job.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it went anyway. So I went from that. In about 3 or 4 months, a job came up in one of the offices out in the shop, actually in the, I forgot what they called it, department. It was like a scrap department. Everything went down there, and you could buy some of the appliances, small appliances that they made or whatever. Everything came down to that department, and they had a little window and a adding machine and a money drawer.
So what did you do there? Besides
I worked in the office. I did just regular office where I was the only girl in the department. And it was only a small office. I did the payroll. I took shorthand. And in fact, the guy that ran the apartment was my boss. And he decided to write articles for industrial magazines. So we had a project that was really outside of the work there, but it was good for it was good for prestige, I guess, for the company, and we did that. So that was a big project, and it lasted almost a year. So I took a lot of shorthand. Then I had to transcribe all the notes and get the articles together and sell the articles that were up for sale. The people in the workforce, if they wanted something, they'd come down and they'd buy it. And I'd make out the slip, put the money in the drawer. Then I had to account for it and bring it to the main office in the front of the building. They had a main it was all offices for the rest of the company. But every department had its own little office, and that's where I started and ended up about 10 years later, because then the war was over, and if you, as I told you before, I think, if you had a husband that was working, you had to give up your job for a returning serviceman, make room for a serviceman, and that's how it was.
That's actually so sexist.
Mm.
What other jobs did you have?
Other jobs after that. All right. Now, at this time, when I had to leave my job, I had gotten married that year.
How old were you when you left the job?
When I left the job, I was 26, I think, 26. I had met a young man, and we decided to get married. So we did. And but I had to leave work because my husband had a job. So I did. But anyway, I got pregnant, and I had a son a year later. So I was home. And besides, if I had stayed, if they didn't have that, when you got pregnant, you had to leave anyway, because you couldn't work. That was it.
So was that the only job that you seriously had, and then did you start volunteering? Do you still volunteer?
Yeah, well, no, that wasn't the only job I had. for a while, I didn't work because of the baby. And then as it happened, I got pregnant again. So I had another baby a year later. First a boy and then a girl, Catherine. She was the second one. She's the middle child. And then I left Westinghouse. I had to leave at the first. I already left Westinghouse, so I worked like at Friendly's again, part-time. All these were part-time
So
jobs.
when you had your kids, you were working part-time too?
Yeah, I worked part-time.
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of things. I did alterations for our case shop. What else did I do? As I say, Friendly's, yeah, because I worked the lunch hour at Friendly's. And I volunteered a few places.
Where?
Let me think what came first. I volunteered for at my church, and that was good.
What was your church? In Westside?
No, our church is the Greek Orthodox Church in Springfield. It's on Memorial Square in the North End.
Mm-hmm.
It's that church up on the hill.
Is it the gold one?
Yeah, yeah,
That's really pretty.
right. And off and on, I always did something. Then I was offered a job, but the kids were older and were pretty self-sufficient. I went to work for Coach Lay Dinner Theater because I knew the woman that and her husband that ran it, and I knew her through the arcade shop because she was the manager there originally when I met her. But they pulled up stakes at the arcade shop and they ran the Coach Lay Dinner Theater. So I did group sales. I had no experience doing group sales. A lot of my jobs were, I learned on the job. So I worked 10 years, almost 10 years there.
So I'm just gonna backtrack to when you left your job because of your husband and having children. What was that like?
Well, it was hard because all the he had been in the Navy, and he was just 1945. He was home from duty because that was over, and so it was hard. Jobs were hard to get, and at that time, the servicemen, it was hard to get jobs too, just like it is now almost. It's hard. You see a lot of soldiers living on the street. I'm losing track of what I'm talking about.
Women having to like leave work because
Right.
of children and husbands.
Right. Right. Well,
Was it just common culture to do that?
everybody had to do that. That was life then. You had to make room for the husbands of, a lot of the soldiers got married, and even other people that needed jobs. And there weren't enough to go around. Manufacturing began to leave the area. Springfield was a manufacturing town. There were a lot of manufacturing all over the city. And when they lost, some of them went south, some of them just disbanded because they lost everything. And So it was hard. It was hard. And, but you know, you did the best you could. We were able to, we built a house in spite of it because my grandparents gave us a piece of property in West Springfield. And my mother had an insurance policy on me that she cashed in so that we could go to the bank. If you went to the bank for a loan, you had to show that you had some money to start with. In other words, they wouldn't give you money to build a whole house.
Yeah.
You had to have the beginning of it, and then they would give you money on loan, you know, your mortgage. So that's what we did. We built a house right up the street, 2 houses away from where I was originally born.
And so when you had children, you left your job and then you built a house, but are you saying that when women had children, when women's husbands worked, they weren't allowed to work?
Well, they couldn't, it depends, if they both worked in the same place, like if they both worked at the Westinghouse, she would have to leave. No, that's not right. If they were both working, and someone's husband was looking for a job at that particular place, well, according to when she was hired, or if she had to leave her job and make room for the man.
Okay, so not necessarily if your husband was working, you couldn't work at all. It was more like if someone else's husband was looking for a job and you were working at a place, then the spot would automatically go to that husband.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And that's how it was for a long time. You could get a job somewhere else, and not all the places had that rule. But you couldn't get away from it. You just had to leave. That's all.
So you mentioned when all of the people came back from World War II, so we're kind of around that area of the Great Depression. So how was your family affected by the Great Depression?
Well, the Depression was in the 30s. It was in the 30s. There were just no jobs available. I don't know. They didn't have to worry about women leaving because the women didn't get the jobs in the first place. And there were no jobs, just no jobs available. Everything just went downhill or petered out.
So how was your family affected? Like life
Well,
at home and everything?
Not that badly, because my father was a foreman at Westinghouse. And, but my mother had to leave. She had to leave. And my grandmother who lived up the street took care of us. And we were in school all day now. We were in school. So she worked early in the morning and came home at 3 o'clock. So I was home from school right after 3 o'clock. So that was ideal for her. But then in 1935, 1933, my father died, and she had to go to work. So, of course, she went back to the Westinghouse to ask for a job, and they gave her one right away because she was trained. And she was a coil winder. They wound, I don't know how that works, but magnetos, and they had to wind these coils, and that's what made the motors run. But it was a hard job. For men, it was even harder for women. And she caught her wedding ring on the hook that processed the wire and broke her elbow because it yanked her arm right out. So after that, no woman could go to work with a ring on. It was written in the rules by the union that you couldn't work at that job with a ring on your finger. I still have a ring, and it's a little distorted.
What was West Side like at that time? Like roads, transportation. You mentioned a trolley system.
Well, one thing for transportation, the buses came into being, and we gradually they pulled up the tracks along the side of the road for the trolleys, because they had wires above too, the whole works. So little by little they got rid of them, and the buses came in. And I was just beginning, probably just starting school, because I remember the trolleys, and I remember riding in one when I was very young. But when I got old enough to ride a bus myself, the buses were already entrenched, and the streets were cleared of all that stuff. And my father got sick. He died, and my mother had to go back to work. And she got a job right away and worked for not the rest of her life, because she eventually had to leave there. And she went to work for a manufacturer that made clothes, a coat manufacturer. And then when we moved to Boston, that brief year, she got a job where she used to work when she was single, making tuxedos. I still have a satin suit that I made out of the satin they used to make the lapels for the tuxedos, because they were satin lapels. I hate to throw it away, but it's falling apart now.
So you mentioned your father dying. How did that how old were you? How did it affect your family?
I was 9 years old. My brother was 2. And that's how my grandmother, her mother and father, came to live with us from Boston. And they stayed with us for 5 years until that time I told you that we came back. My grandmother stayed in Boston. We came back because now I was in high school and my brother was in grammar school, so we came back. But we did not come back to where we live now. We came back to Hungry Hill, and after 3 years, my mother remarried, and we lived in Feeding Hills for a little while. And not long after that, my mother got divorced, and we moved back to West Springfield. So we've been there ever since. That was in 1950. I had gotten married, and here we've been all this time.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you get married? How did you meet your husband?
Oh, you want the romantic
Yeah.
version? We met dancing. This was in 1940, 45, 46, 1948. We used to go to the YWCA on Sunday. I met a bunch of girls through a woman I worked with. It was actually her sister's crowd, but we hit it off when I met them, and they were from the South End, and they went to the Y on Sundays because the Y was a USO during the war, and it still maintained its capacity. And so I went dancing with them on Sunday. By now I had a car, and they didn't have a car, so I was the chauffeur and picked them all up and went to the dances. So we did that, and I learned to dance pretty good. I danced with some good dancers, and he came in one night, and the girls all that I knew all knew him, and he eventually asked me to dance with him because he was pretty picky, and I made fun of him about that after. So, and about a year later, we got married. So that was history. That was 1950.
What was his name?
His nickname was Gus. Gus Pappas. That's Gus, yeah. His real name was Constantine. A lot of Greek boys were named Constantine because that was the king's name when they had a king. So all the mothers named their children Constantine.
Did you know him through church?
No, but I got to know his church through him.
The Greek Orthodox Church?
Is
that where you went?
Orthodox, yeah. It's on the hill there at the north end.
So you weren't originally...
No, I was Catholic.
Okay.
Yeah, I was
So
Catholic.
then you started going there.
Yeah.
All right. And that was important to you?
Well, we had to decide. I thought it was important to decide what church we were going to go to. And his family was very involved in church. And so was I on my end. But someone had to make the decision, or we would have been in trouble because you would be arguing about it. So I decided to join his church.
Mm-hmm.
The ritual, the service is almost identical to the Catholic service.
Mm-hmm.
They just have a few man-made rules that differentiate them. And they pride themselves on being the original church. And that means they don't change. They don't change, which I think they should. I mean, life goes on and life changes. So man-made laws can be changed.
And here's a picture of you winning your award for the church.
Yeah.
So can you explain that, please? How did
What?
you win it? Your award here.
Oh, the award.
Mm-hmm.
This award was a national award. And it's part of the women's group of the church. Philoptohos is the name of it. And it means that they're the arm of the church that helps the homeless or the people that are sick. You know, they do all that good work. And they have to raise money to do it because the church doesn't have money like that. So that's what we do. We donate. We have fundraisers to donate. We bake to donate. And we actually do some of the work ourselves. But this award is, as I say, national. So out of all the dioceses in this country, you can propose someone for that award. And usually the president of your chapter will write a letter about you and what you've accomplished for them. And that's how I won the award. The president at the time, this was about 4 years ago, wrote a letter and sent it to the committee that was processing the letters. And I won. The committee chose me out of the Boston. We're part of the Boston diocese. All of New England, including some parts of Connecticut, belong to the Boston diocese. So I was chosen for it, which I never expected. I told them they had the wrong girl because they wouldn't win. They wouldn't win anything if they proposed me.
Aw.
So
Would you say that's your proudest moment of your life?
not completely, but I was very proud of that. I think the proudest moment of my life is getting married to the man I married and having my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. So that you can't, that's quite an accomplishment.
What are the most important lessons you've learned in life?
Oh dear. Well, one thing is be kind. There's enough turmoil in this world that you don't have to fight with your neighbors or bring them down or whatever. You can get it's easy to get along with people. And that's, I think, what I mostly do. I get along with people, and I'm fine. I'm happy. I wish my husband were here, but we had a good life. We were married for 58 years.
When did he pass away?
In 2008, yeah. He was sick for about 4 or 5 years. He ended up with Parkinson's disease. And that was hard for him. Yeah, so, but we did. We had a good life. And the kids, I have great kids. And great-grandchildren. Did you see the picture of my brood, my 6 great-grandchildren?
No, I didn't.
Oh, you will. There's one there somewhere. Nana. Some call me Nana, and some call me Grandma.
Is there anything you would want to talk about that we didn't touch upon?
I'm happy volunteering. I've been volunteering a long time, only I didn't realize I was volunteering. Just staying after school in grammar school to help the teachers. That was volunteering. I'd spend at least an hour and a half after school. But I love to do it. And I've been doing that right along.
Is the volunteering you're doing now just at your church?
I volunteer at my church. I work 2 days a week, maybe a third if something unusual has to be done. I enjoy doing it. I get along well with everybody. I think that's the secret to anything, is to, just consider the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And unless someone is outwardly really mean to you, but I think you find if you don't treat them in that way, it doesn't work. If you're nice to someone that's really, I'll give you an example. We have this lady at the church who's a grump. She's really a grump. And she's always ready to fight with anybody. Or she talks down to you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she did it to one of we have 3 volunteers in that office. One of the girls, and she was so upset about it because she didn't do anything to her, but she was very, very hard on her. So the next time she came to the office or something, I just smiled at her and I said, "Good morning." And I says, "What can I do for you?" And she smiled at me. And she was very nice and thanked me in the end, for whatever service I did to her. And my coworker says, how did you do that? I said, nothing. I just didn't growl back at her. I just treated her like I treat everybody else that comes to the window for service. And every time she comes to the window, she's got a smile on her face now.
Aww.
Yeah. So there you are. There's an example. You don't have to fight with people. You don't have to be crabby, or if you don't like something, you don't have to really yell at them. Just relax and do what you have to do. That's it.
It's amazing that you volunteer so much at your age and treat people so nicely. And also, how would you want to be remembered?
Oh, maybe simply just I got along with people, that's all. Because I think that just covers everything. Everything falls into place. Think about it. Think about volunteering sometime. Gives you a lot of satisfaction.
So thank you for joining us on West Side Legacy Stories, and also to all the viewers. See you next time.